The reason why Mrs. Bianka Oghenenkumen cheated on her husband. Mr. Anthony Oghenenkumen and his wife Mrs. Bianka Oghenenkumen lived in a town called Udomen in the rainforest of Nigeria. Mr. Anthony worked as a store attendant in a company called Wehidle & Co. The company were into electrical and electronic assembly. The management of the company was corrupt, and for that reason, most of the professional workers resigned. There was a shocking event that happened to one of the staff, Mr. Kamaleif, who was the maintenance supervisor in the electrical and electronic repair unit. Kamaleif received the news that his mother has passed away. With that shock, he slumped and died instantly, as the breadwinner in the family, and had not received his salary for over 7 months. Kamaleif was financially handicapped because the company has not paid its staff for the past 7 months. People thought the reason Mr. Kamaleif slumped and died is that he cannot afford his mother's burial ceremony. Mr. Anthony Oghenenkumen was a man with a God-fearing heart, a man who does not want to dent the family image. It all happened one day, when some of the top manager decided to sell out some of the company vital material in a fraudulent manner, which they tried to involve the store attendant, Mr. Anthony Oghenenkumen. To their greatest surprise, Mr. Anthony Oghenenkumen declined their request, and for that reason, they couldn't carry out their act. Mr. Anthony Oghenenkumen had to resign from the company, and he left without any benefit, for fear of assassins. Nevertheless, 2 weeks later, Mr. Anthony Oghenenkumen secured a driving job with a building construction company and was assigned to drive the general manager, Mr. Luis Idojiawere, and his wife Mrs. Patricia Idojiawere. They have been married for 6 years, and the couple does not have any children. Mr. Luis is the type that doesn't see a beautiful woman without running after them, and that was a challenge between him and his wife. Mr. Anthony was not just a driver, but also assumed the position of a domestic worker, by helping the wife in some of the cleaning and washing in his boss's house. It happened one day, when Mrs. Anthony decided to visit her husband, to know the company he works. That was how Mr. Anthony introduced his wife to his boss, without knowing the character of his boss. Mr. Luis exchanged greetings with Mr. Anthony's wife. At the time she was leaving, Mr. Luis handed her a small white envelope, and she post-rated and left. When Mr. Anthony returned home after closing hours, she handed the envelope to him, and he opened the envelope. There were 200 naira new notes in 10 pieces, which is 2,000 naira. Mr. Luis started visiting Mrs. Bianka Oghenenkumen, enticing her with beautiful gift and money, so as to lure her to bed, which she always declined because of the love she had for her husband, despite their poor state. The hard way of true love. Mr. Anthony fell ill one night, and he was rushed to the hospital and was diagnosed of appendicitis. When the doctor handed the bills to his wife, she could not afford it, and the doctor gave 6 days for them to pay the bills. The doctor said, if they don't pay the bill on time, the husband will die. Mrs. Anthony has gone to all her friends and family members to raise the money, but no one could render her any help. After 2, 3, 4 days in search of help, she couldn't raise the money to pay her husband hospital bills, and she finally went to Mr. Luis for the money, and Mr. Luis saw it as opportunity. Mr. Luis Idojiawere requested for her body, which she declined, and left with anger. Now the 6th day came, she went back to the hospital following morning, she saw her husband was in bad condition. So, the doctor gave her 7 hours to raise the money, or she should take her husband to another hospital. That was where she broke down in tears and finally went back to Mr. Luisi Dojiware. He slept with her in pain and tears and handed her the money. Her husband's operation was successfully done. After some days later, he was discharged from the hospital. Mrs. Patricia Dojiware knew that her husband slept with Mrs. Bianka Oghenenkumen, and was also willing to sleep with Bianca's husband. One day, Mrs. Patricia Dojiware pretended to be sick, that she is having cold and fever. She asked Mr. Anthony Oghenenkumen to boil water for her to massage her body. As soon as the water was ready, she asked Mr. Anthony to get her one of the towel and help to massage her body. While Mr. Anthony was massaging her, she grabbed him and tried to seduce him. Then Mr. Anthony was able to resist her and escape from her grip. As he was trying to run out from the room, Mrs. Patricia Dojiware told him of how her husband also slept with his wife. Mr. Anthony Oghenenkumen burst into uncontrollable tears. Ever since that day, Mr. Luisi Dojiware slept with Bianka Oghenenkumen. She was never happy with herself. Every morning, when the husband left for work, she will start crying and hated herself for sleeping with another man. As Mrs. Patricia Dojiware told Mr. Anthony about her husband slept with his wife, Mr. Anthony became very angry to the extent that he picked up a cutlass and heading home to kill his wife. Immediately as he got home angrily, he met his wife crying bitterly. To his greatest surprise, his wife explained to him why she did what she has done just to save his life when he was in the hospital. So, the two of them burst into tears, and holding each other, they cried and cried together. Mrs. Bianka Oghenenkumen begged her husband to forgive her, so the husband forgives her.